Graham, thank you for joining me in what will be sort of a different conversation and maybe one that both you and I think is really important and maybe nobody else does. But um, recently, what we saw at our own, not our own, but our community's professional conference was you had submitted a abstract. For those, that's basically a proposal to run a workshop. It was accepted in however many months ago. And then what ensued after that was requests for revisions about the content of the abstract, discussions of how this might make other people feel if you presented this abstract. And ultimately, after that back and forth, the conference committee ultimately decided this abstract was no longer accepted for this presentation. For me, having had something similar happen before in relation to something I was going to present at a conference in a similar community, this was, I would say, a little bit unsurprising. At the same time, it still doesn't make it any less alarming to me. So, do you want to say a little bit about what happened from your perspective this year?
Uh, yeah, sure. And thanks for having me on. It's been a
Mm.
long wait, Will. Um, yeah, so the abstract went in, and what I wanted to do, because it is the thing that I think is important in the field of working with young people, regardless of discipline and everything, and that's human rights as being a minimum standard. It's the starting point for where therapeutic progress can be developed. And that's because I have a particular view on mental health, which is that mental health is, or mental distress comes from things that have happened to people, either deliberately or because we live in an unkind world. So for me, human rights are about ensuring that people are protected from the things that are unreasonable. And I think that then means that's the start of therapy because we need, if we're trying to heal the harms that have been done to people, we need to establish a baseline where there will be no harms and we can build from there. So I think human rights is important. And I wanted to talk about that. But I wanted to do a replication basically on a presentation that was done in Latvia middle of last year by two um, people from a psychiatric institution over there who I believe were doing outpatient work with teenagers in an adventure context. And one was a physiotherapist and the other was a psychotherapist. I think that's what they were. I can't quite remember. But they ran this workshop and they would put to us a scenario and say, so this has happened. Oh, this was the plan. This is what's happened. What do you do? Go
Hmm.
to that side of the tent if you give them some sort of consequence or hold this individual to be responsible for what's not going right, that sort of thing. Go to this side of the tent if we don't come down hard on these young people and instead we find some other way of solving the problem that is less punitive. And they were pretty mild, Will. They were not major things. No one was trying to murder anyone with a knife. It was just you
Hmm.
turned up for the train late, not life threatening. So I thought this was really interesting because where I found myself was on the opposite side of the tent from people who work in psychiatric facilities.
Hmm.
And they're not bad people or anything. They just had a bit more of a no, these people have got to learn the real life consequences of this and that. And I'm thinking, well, I think they've learned the real life consequences of things. It's just they've learned it through the harms that are done to them. So does piling on that um, make that better? Does it make them more resilient? Or does it just add to the depth of problem that's been foisted upon them? So I thought this is really interesting. It wasn't as if, by the way, I'm the only person on that side of the tent. There were
Hmm.
others with me, but I did notice consistently some people who I was a little bit surprised because they're from more of the mainstream mental health tended to be on the other side of the tent from me. So I thought, let's try this in Taiwan with a different group of adventure therapy people, because that was Europe.
Hmm.
And I just wanted to run the same thing. But what I also wanted to do was point to um, an incident that happened in the US in February of last year, which is just awful. And if you read the coroner's report, it's horrific. That a young person was killed by suffocation in a Gore-Tex, I believe it was Gore-Tex
Hmm.
bivy bag that was completely sealed. So he had no air tube, and other things were involved as well. But that's the mechanism of death. What killed him was the actions of adults who were supposed to be caring for him. I thought, this is really interesting. By the way, I have no particular malice towards the people who were involved in that building on that night. They were doing what they're told. I'm concerned
Right.
more about the practices. So I wanted to have that experiment and that replication of, how do we feel about human rights? Here's a scenario. Go to that side if you think we should do this. Go to that side if you think we should do that. Play a number of those scenarios. But with the context being that when we don't have stop signs to tell us when we're going too far in consequences and those sorts of things, the slippery slope might end up, because it's actually happened, that a young person is killed.
Hmm.
Doesn't happen very often, but how many other harms are caused to people that don't get to the bottom of that slippery slope because we don't have those stop signs? So I wanted to say, here's what we're trying to prevent in the worst case scenario, and what are the stop signs, the lines on the road down that hill that should tell us to stop, pause, reflect, and those would be the scenarios that we were going to look at. And I also ended it off, and this is the thing that actually got the presentation canned, was that I wanted to raise that in our broad field, we are not in agreement on human rights. We're not in agreement on what are minimum standards and things like that, to the extent that there is peer reviewed literature supporting the sorts of things I think are human rights violations in terms of providing adequate shelter and um, food and a whole range of really basic things. I understand why they're doing it, but again, they don't seem to have. There's not a lot of good stop signs to say how much of this is too much.
Hmm.
And I wanted to draw people's attention to the fact that these practices, which I believe we should be um, putting out there as do not do these things, are actually being endorsed in literature, in research, in textbooks, and have been since I did my training back in 99, 2000. And
Hmm.
those people are those that body of research, that belief about how change happens is still very much in the literature and being uh, to different levels being articulated in things that are being produced now. So it's not as
Hmm.
if these ideas are old and gone away. They haven't. They're still there. And I thought it would be worth us knowing this is the worst case, but also what do we think about this, I think, misleading approach to health um, continuing to be uh, promulgated? Is that right? No, spoken about at conferences as if it's a good and useful thing to do. And I don't think we have agreement that that's. Sorry about the dash hound.
That's okay. That's okay. So, excuse me. So, there's the dog. One of the, let's back up for a second. So,
Yep.
one of the things I dragged you into, and those listening to this may hear Graham's accent, and we've heard this thought before. Graham does not sound very American. I also do not sound very American anymore, but I assure you, I am American.
It's a matter of opinion, Will.
That's right. Um, one of the um, one of the things I dragged Graham into when our friendship and working relationship started was I was doing my doctoral research, and interviewing young people who had been to American wilderness therapy programs. And that is an industry many of them know with Paris Hilton's advocacy work and the tens of thousands of survivors that have spoken out would know this as being called the troubled teen industry, of which I spent my from 18 to 22 years old working in the woods. And so when I was interviewing people, I was really interested in what do young people experience at these adventure therapy programs. Now, what happened, and this is naturally so, is past wilderness therapy clients were the easiest people to find. Why is that? Well, they congregate on social media groups and say either this was the greatest experience, it changed my life, or why did my parents have me kidnapped and taken to the woods where I was strip searched and why were my boots taken at night? Why was I told who to talk to, when to talk to? They didn't let me leave. I couldn't call my mom, things like this. And in my mind, what I started thinking was, wow, this is actually really bad therapy. Like, this is just not even, there's no literature to support that this is at all a psychotherapy. And at the same time, there's some people who say this works, and there's a lot of people who are saying that they were really harmed. And what I started thinking was, we've never spoken about this at conferences. This doesn't come up. And I was reading at the time a lot of, you know, feminist epistemology, a lot of social work literature, social work theories. What does it mean to even be experiential? And what I started thinking is these practices are antithetical to just about everything I read about in adventure therapy or experiential learning literature. And this is notwithstanding ethics, like that's a whole different piece to this. And what I started thinking, especially as I was reading the feminism literature, was why is the dominant narrative of adventure therapy literature stemming from a select group of programs and research centers that are embedded into this wilderness therapy practice? And what can we do to deconstruct this to say, one day, even though I was practicing in Australia, your organization was in Australia, one day this is going to bite us in the ass. And that when we say we do adventure therapy, someone's going to go, what? You mean that practice of kidnapping kids that I saw on Dr. Phil? You mean what happened to Paris Hilton? You do that? And then we're stuck in the position of defending our own practice. And by the way, we saw this happen last year where Australia's federally funded National Disability Insurance Scheme said, we are no longer funding wilderness therapy. Now, this was a bit of a joke because they never did fund wilderness therapy. And as far as I know, no one in Australia does anything that's called wilderness therapy anymore, for the most part. So, but it did lead to people who are working in the disability sector to actually be made redundant because there was no more funding for outdoor therapy work. So it did bite a lot of people in the ass. So, Graham, this has been a passion of mine where I joke with people that my research agenda is psychotherapy works and we kind of don't know why, and then don't hurt children. It seems for some reason to be hardly controversial, but still we're at this place where this research agenda is accepted and then ultimately unwelcomed at a professional conference with the title in the name of the very thing you and I did our doctoral research about. So, how did you get dragged into the troubled teen industry and find an interest or passion about this?
Um, yeah, good story. As as in the story of how I got here is not a straight line. So
Hmm.
I when I was running an outdoor education center, um, and I was still going out on expedition. I was still doing a lot of facilitating, a lot of instructing, but I had a team that I was working with, etc. My wife and I decided to become foster carers. And of course, when you become foster carer, the agency with all these kids wants to do a camp. Who do they call on? They call on Graham. So I ran camps at our center for kids in foster care. And I also did set up my own business. I sort of stopped doing the outdoor education thing for a couple of years, and I ran my own little business where it was just me, and I was working with about 10 young people who were unfosterable. And so they were living in a house by themselves with 24/7 shift rotation of youth workers, sometimes two youth workers on one young person alone in that house, because of the level of troubling behavior that was attached to them. And I saw them when they came out to do little adventures with me. It was all half day stuff. And we had a climbing wall and flying fox, and we went for bushwalks and we went canoeing and played a lot of games and those sorts of things. And a lot of what I did was the best of what I could pluck out of the outdoor education field. You know, I knew an activity worked really well. I'd run it for these kids. And I don't know, 75% of the time it worked really well. And then the rest of the time it worked really badly. And like
Mm.
you, I'm starting to go, why is this not working? Like it should. It works for normal kids. And what are we doing wrong? And Anita Pryor, actually, I was just talking about these things at the fourth International Adventure Therapy Conference in Rotorua, New Zealand. And I was just asking everybody, how do I answer this question? What is it that I'm doing wrong? And Anita Pryor said, how about you think of your work through the lens of trauma? And she sent me one paper by Bruce Perry. And I've been reading the complex trauma literature ever since. And that was 2004. So I'm 20 years now. I've been trolling through this stuff, trying to figure it out. Fast forward a little bit. I was now full time in adventure therapy. And I decided to do some research to answer this question of why does it work sometimes and why does it seem to have a really bad effect? And so I started doing a PhD on complex trauma being healed by adventure therapy. And I thought it'd be easy. I'll just join the two things together. And while I'm dealing with all of this stuff, what are we doing? What is it about adventure therapy that sometimes doesn't work? What is it about complex trauma that makes it really difficult to work with sometimes? I got a phone call from you after whichever forum conference it was down in Victoria some few years ago, and I remember stopping beside the road. I was driving at night. I was just about to get home. I thought, if I get home, this conversation will have to end. And it's really interesting because you were telling me about some of the things that were fairly standard practice in your experience between the ages of what, 18 and 22, I think you said.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah. And I was thinking, wow, that's familiar. It's not the same, but I, ex-army, have been a bit of a hard ass forcing some things to happen in outdoor education. And it would seem to work. But when I did it with our kids with complex trauma, the wheels really fell off. So I started questioning whether that worked in fact or whether I just thought it worked.
Hmm.
But what all the things you're talking about, I thought, I don't know that I've gone that far, but it's familiar, disturbingly familiar, because clearly this is more than I would have done, but I have done this.
Mm.
Um, And after that kind of phone call, I had a big think about things, and I happened to be in communication via social media with somebody who'd been in a wilderness therapy program. And at the same time, we had politically, we had a bunch of refugees who tried to get into Australia by boat, and they were being warehoused on Manus Island, which is not an Australian territory, and they were not going to be allowed into Australia. And they were being put into detention facilities, which were effectively army tents in a tropical island. You can imagine what that's like, surrounded by lots of wire and concrete.
Hmm.
Um, and there were children in there, and Australian psychologists in particular were and more speaking out about how bad this was for the psychological health of those young people. Um, and so I'm hearing about this stuff from the US. I'm thinking, well, that's the US. They're a bit weird. What's it got to do with me? And there's one person from the US who'd been in this stuff. He said to me, just messaging backwards and forwards. And there's a reason I was talking to him, by the way, doing my research. He said, if you who think you're going to be an expert, which is what apparently you are when you finish a PhD,
Right.
if you think you're going to be an expert and you're not prepared to speak out about what happens in wilderness therapy, which is in your field, then who will? And I sat and thought about it for a couple of weeks and was looking at what was happening on Manus Island, thinking, well, psychologists are speaking out about that and they've never been to Manus Island, but they
Hmm.
can see what's going on. They understand the theories and principles. And to them, it's quite clear that being detained on a tropical island indefinitely for not, for just trying to reach safety
Hmm.
is going to be bad for these young people. And I thought, well, actually, I don't need to go on a wilderness therapy program like Will has. I can see how this would be bad, but I still didn't have the theory come. I didn't understand what we were doing wrong in adventure therapy, nor what we were doing wrong in complex trauma, and why the two things matched up really well, but not all the time. I didn't have that, but I just knew at that point, although it's in the States, it is what I'm researching, and I know I will get some more information on this before I just blindly follow down this path. And that's when I got onto social media, started meeting more and more people who have been through wilderness therapy in the States, getting more and more detail. The thing that struck me, and I'll stop it now, but the
Hmm.
thing that struck me when I was talking to these people, typing, chatting, and reading their stories online, was that they were describing things that were worse than what you told me on the phone
Hmm.
and never mentioned in our literature. And that was really disturbing to me. If there's so many people having this experience, but the only literature about these programs is wonderful and it works 424% of the time, whatever it is, um, why are we not told the context in which these results are coming from? What's going on there? Because to me, it looks like you do these things, they're human rights violations, it's going to hurt people. You can't be doing mental health work if you're also denying people their rights, their basic rights of being safe in the world. But we've got a whole body of literature that's telling us that it's a wonderful thing to do, except that they're not telling us about the human rights violations.
Hmm.
And that's what got me hooked in.
Yeah. So I'm trying to think of how to segue to the next thing I wanted to discuss, which is you start you're writing your PhD about adventure therapy and complex trauma, and then it gets time, you submit your final dissertation. It goes to a blinded review. Well, obviously you're not blinded, but the you don't know who the reviewers are. And then um, what did you know? I mean, this again is where I find it so sad that we have to have this conversation, that not hurting children and publishing good research and transparent research shouldn't have to be something that we're discussing. Um, can you share what ended up happening from when you put in to have your thesis and doctoral research examined?
Sure. And the thing of blind review is that there's often you do have an idea of who is reviewing your work because it's such a small field.
And let me say, that's exactly it. This there are times we in our tiny community with what, let's say at the most 20 PhDs in our community. Like I don't know how many there are, but it's not a lot. We can sometimes even tell by the title. I go, if I see a paper, I get asked to review it and it says adventure therapy and complex trauma, I say, that's probably Graham. I cannot give an objective review of this. Or if someone reads feedback informed treatment in outdoor therapy, they're going to go, oh, that's Will. I can't do an objective review of this. So we have a tiny community, which makes this hard. But I think what I want to talk about is why has this become impossible,
Mm.
which is what has happened with your abstract at this conference. So, sorry, please continue with your thesis examination.
Yeah, sure. So the I knew the reviewers were likely to be two of the 10 names that I put forward as people I thought were suitable to give intelligent comment and advice. So that was the case. And when I found out when the thesis was eventually accepted, I got shown evidence of who those two people were, and they were on my list. So they're people I selected to look at my work and critique it.
Which makes it even more amazing.
It does. And we're not going to throw people under the bus. There won't be
Yeah.
any names or anything in
No.
this. Again, it's such a small world. In our field. I'm sure people will understand just from the description. Um, but that's not my intention. It's the process. So I put the thesis in. Incidentally, I have a friend who I worked with some years ago in residential care. He was my boss. He put his thesis in for assessment in March, and he just this week was had his PhD conferred because the thesis was accepted.
Hmm.
So yeah, that's about right. 3 6 months, everything should be good. Um, I had to wait until well after the due date for the assessors to finish their work. There's nothing I can do to speed that up, but it was
Hmm.
well after the due date. And I got the two responses, and one was effectively a half page, so like two paragraphs, um, and the other was 42 pages. Still think it's still quite ludicrous.
It was like 60,000 words.
No, I don't know that I counted the words, but
Yeah.
42 pages. So for people who haven't done these sorts of things, effectively, you've got to respond to every comment that is um, specific. So that means it's not quite every sentence, but probably every 2 or 3 sentences, you've got to give a response to that comment. So 42 pages has a lot was a
Mm.
very long table of responses, and it took me a while to put that together. Um, and I remember that the 42 were often Graham is wrong. He doesn't understand what he's talking about. He hasn't read the literature, that sort of thing. Um, which is fair if that is true. And yeah, there's always things you haven't read because there's a lot of things to read. Um, I did my response, and as I was doing it, I was able to rebut a number of things, like say, this is the evidence for that, this is the evidence for that, and kind of get those things through without too much drama. But as I was doing it, I was telling my supervisors, you know, they're going to reject this again. And my
Mm.
supervisor said, Graham, you can't know that. If you do your job right, there'll be no reason to reject what you're doing. So I did the revisions. My supervisor looked through every word of it, and we went backwards and forwards to make sure it was well written, it was evidenced, and all the rest of it. My other secondary supervisor also looked at it. I think I even sent bits and pieces to other people to check,
Hmm.
am I right in saying this? And I'm sure some of that went your way, Will, but
Hmm.
I was also talking to a couple of other people who I consider to be mentors at times. Um, and again, after I submitted, it took a long time for those things to come back. And uh, I do I mention Latvia, Will?
No.
Okay. Um, so people who are wondering, I went to a conference in Latvia, which was lovely. And it was, I reckon 6 months after I'd done the revisions and submitted them before I got told that yes, in July, and I was in Latvia and America in uh, April and June,
Mm.
um, that yes, it's been conferred. But in between that, what happened was that the reviewer, the assessor who gave me the 42 pages, had given a response. I've never seen it. I don't know what they said. I've asked for it so that I could do better in my writing since. And my university said, this person effectively has been dismissed for their hostility. That's the university's word. And their assessment no longer matters because we're not looking at it. Instead, it's going to this other panel. And so it went through another round of assessment with another couple of people looking at it after 2 rounds of assessment already, and was conferred. So that's the story of my thesis. So I put it in 1st of February 2023. It was conferred in about the 27th of July 2024. So an 18-month journey, not
Mhm.
3 or 4 months like my friend just got.
Yeah. So, and what makes this story even, and I mean, I don't think anybody is boo-hooing the life of an academic and a researcher and writing and these sort of things. At the same time, what is so deeply troubling to me is all of this happens in closed doors. It all is hidden behind a process that's supposed to preserve the integrity of science. And what we have experienced here is preserving the dominant narrative. And what that is doing is putting a blanket over harm to children. And so while we were waiting for your thesis to be reviewed, you, well, I guess let's back up just a little bit further to 2022. I'm sitting in Renee's on a work trip, so we're in London. I was in a hotel room by myself. I thought, I'll do some writing on something. I'm sure I had a project on the go. And I got an alert that an article about wilderness therapy came out in The Guardian. And I read it and I went, this is too much information for a journalist to get about the good narrative of wilderness therapy. It was saying this stuff works. Yes, there's some concerns, but the research is so impressive um, that this is a great treatment for youth. And I think this is the first time I ever wrote a Twitter thread, and I wrote a response to it, and many of the people who refer to themselves as survivors. These are people who went to these programs and view that the harm they experienced was so bad that they refer to themselves as they survived this treatment. And survivors came out and they would say things like, "Well, Will, you've run a wilderness therapy program. You worked in this field, so you profited off the abuse of children." So I was being called a child abuser, and my response to that was, you don't have to trust me. I know that I look like the part. I've got the plaid, I've got the hat, I've got the shitty beard. I look the part of the adventure therapy people. And I try to say, but I'm on your side on this. Like, here's my PhD. Here's the stuff I've written about transporting, the legalized kidnapping of children. Here's the stuff I've written. And you and I started talking to the survivors. And what ultimately came out of it, we met some who had journeyed into a world of research, who wanted to research how could this have happened to me. And they, and what ended up happening, we started working on a paper. So your background, again, this is not really too important to the theme of this discussion, but when we talk about trauma, trauma is often synonymous with dissociation. That's just when your brain turns off. We all do it while driving a car, whenever you've driven to work and think, I don't even remember this drive. That's because you dissociated the good way, the normal way you're supposed to, when your brain does a favor for you. And what you did with this group of survivors and two experts in the field of dissociation. You went through and got publicly sourced material, podcast interviews. Many people will remember the reality TV show Brat Camp. These are the types of programs we're talking about. So we have hours of publicly available data. And you went through and watched all the Brat Camps, time stamped interviews, and together with survivors, we drafted a paper that it might not be the intention of this program to hurt children and hurt them so much that it causes a trauma effect of dissociation, but that the mechanisms of change delivered by these programs, inherently, this is just the likely outcome. We we had a quote in the start of this paper about we had a quote in there from an owner who started a bunch of wilderness therapy programs saying it's the what is it? It's the threat. That's the magic of the wilderness. It's the threatening experience. Like no therapist in the world would say, what's the secret sauce to your clinical work? Threat. So it's so pertinent to the practice that they can't even see that this is wrong to treat children this way. And it's been what, 2 years since that paper was finished?
Yeah.
And all it has been is delayed, dragged, and every time it's one reviewer will say accepted, and one will say, but you don't understand wilderness therapy practice and you don't get it. And one of the reviewers who delayed this paper for about a year, and research is slow, so we're not having a victim mindset here. But one of the papers got delayed a year because at the same time as the reviewer was reviewing your PhD, they were delaying this paper as well. And we had to go to the editor and say, this person can no longer review this work. And so it was a total breach of the spirit of a double-blind peer review because this reviewer knew exactly what you're writing about, dissociation, complex trauma, adventure therapy, which is what we were writing about. And what was so alarming was the tone of that review and putting down the survivors that we had written with. And basically, I don't remember the exact term. You probably will. I'll pass back to you in a second. Putting putting down and saying, but they're not an authority to talk on this. And I honestly, I could not believe that academic leaders of our field behind closed doors would be this controlling to make sure a narrative about not harming children could not see the light of day.
Yeah, the phrase that I think you're referring to is the survivor. One of them is a published, peer-reviewed, published author in their own right, and we included some quotes from there. And so the reviewer was responding to those quotes, that lived experience quote of this is what happened to them, not a theoretical thing like I have to talk about because it hasn't happened to me. Is
Right.
this happened to them? And the reviewer called them a disgruntled past participant.
That's right. Disgruntled.
And that same person can explain how they were using dissociation in order to escape the fear, threat, pain, discomfort, humiliation of the experience that they were having in wilderness therapy. I think that's a little bit more than being disgruntled.
No kidding.
That's being fundamentally harmed. Um, yeah. So yeah, I wrote that article because I was actually waiting for assessor number one
Yeah.
to give us a response to the thesis. One of the responses to the thesis, so I had a little bit of time on my hands, so I couldn't really do anything much else. So this was an expansion of a point that I raised in the thesis, and so yeah, it was a bit strange dealing with the same person as assessor one and reviewer two. or review or three. It's a bit,
Mhm.
it's odd. It's not, it's a very unusual thing. Um, I would like to back up a little. So, Will, you did your thesis about experiences of wilderness therapy, but you really honed in on the transport, the involuntary transport piece, which is often in the survivors' communications online, something they point to as something that caused PTSD,
Mhm.
and causes them to wake up screaming in the night, even decades later, causes them to be unable to walk between two people out down a footpath because that's what happened to them when they were transported. They were grabbed by two people who escorted them, one on either side. And so now they can't walk with their friends. Really basic things that are have been intruded upon because of that single experience, which is a fairly short space of time. 24 hours, the transport's basically done. Um, and people have often thought that I'm also discussing and writing about the same thing, but I'm not. I'm leaving it to you,
Yeah.
the transport bit. Although I totally acknowledge what's going on, but I don't think we need two people looking at the same thing. I'm interested in practice. What happens after transport? What happens from the moment of arrival at program through to the moment of departure that is allegedly healing? And how is it different to what I do? And troublingly, quite often, where I would take canoeing, they might do canoeing. I might walk up a hill knowing it's a hard job. They would walk up a hill knowing it's a hard job. So many of the things we do are actually similar.
Yeah.
Camp it in a on the ground with eating food that's cooked in a tin off a fire. I would do that as well. Lighting a fire by friction with a bow and drill. I'm a survival instructor, by the way. In the
Hmm.
army, I did survival. I was one of the more highly trained ones in the Australian Army at the time. I love that stuff, but I'm a volunteer for it.
Hmm.
And if somebody made me do those things, it would be quite different. So I'm interested in the practices, whereas you tend to focus more on the transporting part, which is diabolical by itself. While we were waiting for both the article, and I'm the first to admit I'm not a great writer, so there's almost always something that I can tidy up in the way I write. I fully admit that. But that's not why we were being rejected. We were being rejected because didn't want this story about the possibility of the treatment being harmful.
Hmm.
Um, while we were waiting for that article to come out, which was in the end was human rights are really important and that should be the minimum standard. And there's a whole range of things that would prevent. While we're waiting for that, and I'm also waiting for my thesis, um, that's when that young fellow was killed in that bag. And I remember thinking back shortly after that happened, thinking, what chance was there? And probably none, but I can't help thinking about it even now. What chance was there? Would there have been if my work had been visible and understood and talked about in our community? Would that situation have been modified? Would it have changed? Would that boy not be dead now?
Yeah.
And I think that's a real consequence of the work that we're trying to do, the how we're trying to explain this narrative which is being suppressed. That's a real consequence that we as a field need to live with. That we this was entirely preventable by fairly simple changes. And in my thesis, so because it's not in the literature, I was talking to these survivors and I actually got them. I asked a question. I said, can you tell me about things that both worked well and didn't work well for you on wilderness therapy after 2014, which is when I was doing my literature review was backdated to 2014. So I wanted to do a comparison, what I saw in the literature to their lived experience. And quite a number of them replied. And I saw some other comments and I asked them, and I only recorded the things that had happened to people since 2014. And I was doing this around about 2000. So it was about 6, 8 years back. So it was pretty recent. And a lot of the things were actually within a year or 18 months of the person making the statement to them. So very current. And I listed all of those things, and it's a pretty awful list.
Hmm.
But one of my thinkings was, I don't know where, but in my thesis, I need to be able to give people some specific guidance around things that we shouldn't do and things that are quite okay to do. So in my thesis, one of the chapters, though I think it's the last one, lists a number of these things, explains why the things that the survivors had told us are not healthy and useful for them and often cause problems later. I would list them, give them a complex trauma treatment reason we should not do that thing or the limitations to that thing, and to give guidance to our field. I'm really now going back to that. Would we have been able to prevent that death? As a result of my writing, I'm quite sure, although I can't, I would give you
Who
definitive
knows? Yeah.
proof. Watching Facebook, wilderness therapy programs were in trouble because Paris Hilton had done a movie and all that sort of stuff. We might talk about that. They were getting a lot of attention, negative attention, and their numbers were dropping. Their enrollment numbers were dropping. Didn't have anything to do with me because I hadn't done any publishing to that point.
Yeah.
But what was happening is their numbers were going down and their businesses were becoming unviable because they weren't getting enough throughput of people. So they suddenly decided, and it happened with two or three different organizations, that they suddenly decided in the last few months before they actually closed, we have to do some things differently. What can we do different to change this story, this bad press they kept on saying,
Hmm.
about negative consequences of being on our programs? And I was really pleased to see that some of the things I put in my thesis, um, and in our article, which was available because I put it up on the preprint server because we were still not published, but
Yeah.
everybody can access the versions of it. Um, and I was putting up on there uh, some of these things. These are the things that we should eliminate. And one organization suddenly purchased a shower trailer so that young people could have a shower, which you think that's a pretty small thing. It's not a big deal. When you're in dirty, harsh environments for 3 months and your
Hmm.
only access to hygiene is to dip your bandana in the water of the can that you use to cook your meals, you can't really get properly
Yeah.
clean. I think, what do they call it? Permadirt.
Yes.
Because the dirt's so ingrained in your skin, you can't actually wash it off until you're in a shower for half an hour or something. So one organization instituted a shower trailer. Yay, I thought that was a great idea. It's just basic human decency, allow people to be clean.
Hmm.
Another one, they arranged for a satellite phone, Starlink and whatever, to be able to communicate with the outside world. These are the same organizations that would censor letters, not provide letters. They would stop them and not deliver them.
Hmm.
When there were phone calls, the therapist is sitting over the top of it, terminating the call if the
Hmm.
young person started saying, very controlled. And they suddenly decided, we'll give unrestricted communication via satellite. You can see them on a screen. I thought, that's a different thing, isn't it? So if those are two obvious things to me that if they didn't come from the work that I was putting out, then they were the right thing to do anyway. And so I suspect they were responses to some of the things that you and I were publishing. So if that could have happened, would we have actually been able to prevent uh, the improvised restraint of a young person using camping gear,
Hmm.
which was happening to every single young person who arrived at that program? This is not, this person was weird, doing
No.
weird, unusual things. This was just a uniform. When you arrive, you get restrained for the first night, maybe the second, maybe the third, until your therapist sees you. And you're restrained in gear that means you can't worm your way out and escape.
Yeah. Well, Graham, let's pause for a moment, and I've taken some notes of what we can do for the second part of this interview, which will be made available for those on the Kids These Days launch team. But let's pause, take 5 minutes, toilet break, refresh our coffee cups, and then come back. So I'll hit the pause button if that's okay.
So we're coming back for the part two, or to
Yes.
finish off part one. Okay, so
Yeah, part two.
what's going to be different about part two to part one for those who are wondering whether to come across?
Well, we're going to get into Paris Hilton and the revenge of the clients that we're seeing and talk about the letter that we wrote together about these practices
Hmm.
and then circle back into how is it possible that given the amount of work you have done on this topic, um, becoming a respected voice not only by the survivors, considering that you have nothing to do professionally with wilderness therapy before starting this journey. And we're going to circle back and talk about some what I guess you and I think are some of the core principles of ethical research and research integrity, and why it's no wonder that the general public is losing faith in academic institutions. Because I can tell you from my experience, I'd have little faith in the institutions, based on what you and I have experienced and what's allowed to be published. And we're talking about not killing children. It seems hardly controversial,
Mm.
but you've been rejected from a conference because of it. About It's incredible. Anyway, I'm going to pause the recording, and I hope you all enjoyed this discussion and part two as well.
Thanks for listening.